I would be walking down the street, and there would be some shadows underneath a tree, and I'd see dead people on them. I'd see, you know, mainly dead Marines. People would I'd see the shape of their pack and their equipment, and I would know they were dead. I did see some dead Vietnamese too, and it usually happened when there was um, some kind of shape or shade or dark place that created it. The shapes within a dark place or something. And I didn't tell people. I thought that if I tell people this, somebody's going to lock me up. And this is before I started talking to people about PTSD or even knew what it was. But I had it, very obviously had it. And then back in the 90s, I read a novel by Pat Barker, a British novelist, about World War One, and there was Sassoon, Siegfried Sassoon, the poet, is a real character in the novel, along with Wilfred Owen, and both of them had been interned in Craig Lockhart Hospital for the Insane, and Owen had been sent there because he was shell shocked, and Sassoon was sent there to keep him from being court-martialed. I don't know if you knew his story, but he was a platoon commander, a war hero, British war hero and poet, highly decorated, who one day wrote a letter to Parliament in which he scathingly described what he thought about their war, because he was seeing so much death in the war, but he thought the war was stupid, should have never been, and so on. Anyhow, his friend Robert Graves, also a poet, a novelist you probably heard of,
Yep.
Talked to people in high places, and instead of court-martialing him for coming out, letter of resistance, they decided that they would put him in a mental hospital. So then they could say that he was crazy. That's why he said these things. So anyhow, there is another real character in the novel who did a lot of the early, very good and helpful work about post-traumatic stress disorder, which was called in those days neurasthenia or shell shock, combat fatigue. Those are the early names for it. But Sassoon, in one of his interviews with Rivers, talks about seeing dead people. And Rivers said, well, this is a common symptom. You're not crazy. People see this. So I thought, oh, now I can talk about this, that it's a known phenomena. And, I began to talk to therapists about this. And I've written about it also. I have a poem about it. But the brain will do amazing things, when put under pressure, and that's apparently one of them.
Yeah, we have 28 defense mechanisms.
Yeah.
And multiple ones can be kicked off at the same time, depending on what's going on.
Yeah. But, I've also come to believe that reality is much stranger than we give it credit for. That people think of reality, they think they're describing something solid and prosaic that they can always depend on to measure everything non-real from. But in fact, reality itself is stranger than we can imagine. So that's one of the things I learned from years and years and years of therapy. Once I began it, I continued it.
Was seeing dead people ever resolved for you?
Um, Only in the sense that I could now talk about it and not be seen as insane, at least by open-minded
Mhm.
people.
Is this something that you still experience to this day or to some degree or
It's been, I think, Halloween about 5 years ago was the last time I saw dead people. I haven't seen them since.
and was that in relation to still like with dead soldiers or Vietnamese?
Yeah, very much so. Um,
Were they all familiar? Was this all familiar faces or um
no, they're just shapes mainly, but death makes everybody the same in a way, you know. So that's kind of what I saw: shapes and things, and of course the feeling that went along with it was horrible. You know, it was I didn't want to have those feelings. Um, I did a lot of alcohol and drugs for many years in order to not deal with that stuff.
Mhm.
Um, I've been back to Vietnam twice, which helps. I went back in 2000 with a delegation from the Joiner Institute for the study of war and its social consequences. And I went back again in 2019 for an international poetry festival. And it was a wonderful thing to go back and to see all these beautiful Vietnamese and happy cities and celebration. You know, both the times I went back were in the middle of Tet, which is the Vietnamese New Year, and you'd see wedding parties and lots of decorations and stuff. It's a very happy time to be there, and that's helped a great deal letting go of the war. I had a Vietnamese student in my class last semester at UMass. I taught a course in literature and film of the Vietnam War, and she was, of course, the grandchild of the war. Um, Her father was a child of who was born at the end of the war, and that was good. I had three other Vietnamese in the class too, but she wanted me to come to her graduation so I could meet her father and we could take a group picture. And you know, this is, I think, cultural. You know, that they would want this, and it was a beautiful time. We went out to dinner and talked. So my connections to the Vietnamese are very important.
has that helped? And so that's trying to find the right way to describe it. But that has brought a lot of peace to you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and also uh, an astonishment that they don't hate us. You know, it's
Yeah.
when do you know the novel The Sorrow of War by Bao Ninh?
Yes, it's been a long time since I've read it, but yeah.
Um, I met him through the Joiner Institute in the 90s. And I asked him, we were all sitting in a bar, and I asked him, how come you don't hate us? And he said, well, we had the Chinese for 2,000 years. We had the French, the Japanese, and then the French again. You are merely the most recent. So I was able to see uh, the huge span of history of being a colonized country.
Yeah.
And it just seems to me that the American War was the end of that, the continuation of the colonialism, and that it was
Mhm.
over. They
Yeah.
were no longer colonial.
Um, I remember this one moment in a class. You said you talked to somebody who was a former soldier for the Vietnamese. Just to give the audience an idea as to the Vietnamese mentality in war or in the war. You asked him what was his first thoughts when he saw the American soldiers, these
Yeah.
giant American soldiers arrive.
Yeah, that was Ngan Ven, who's another poet, and who was he was a platoon commander with the NVA division that we were engaged quite frequently engaged with in Quang Nam province. So it is entirely possible that my unit was in a firefight with his unit,
Hmm.
you know, which I thought was really amazing. But we had dinner together or lunch together on a floating restaurant in the Da Nang River. And I asked him these questions. And I said, what did you think of these big Americans coming into your country? And he said, easier to hit.
Yeah.
And then he talked about how naive the Americans were, that the Marines, when they landed at Nha Trang, would drop to a kneeling position to return fire. It was quite easy to pick them off. Of course, they did that once. I think by the time I got there, everybody was down on their belly, the firefight. But you know, it just shows you how little the command structure knew of the war they were sending people into. The fact that they would think that that was okay, you know, to have people drop to one knee to return fire.
Yeah. What was it like going into Vietnam? Were people talking about what was going on there to the soldiers? Were they was there a lot of judgment or hatred towards the Vietnamese?
Yeah, all of the above. There, by the time I got there, the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, the men I was attached to as a corpsman, had been on a number of operations in the Quay San Valley where they had taken terrible casualties. And also in the area I was in, there were constant sniping and booby traps and mines everywhere. And we had figured out by that time that the people we were fighting the war for were very likely our enemy. You know, that we had this illusion that we were defending the poor South Vietnamese from the terrible communist aggressors, and when in fact 80% of South Vietnam hated the Vietnamese government, and who overtaxed them and, you know, just treated them, you know. South Vietnam was about wealthy Vietnamese in Saigon versus 80% of the other Vietnamese who lived in the countryside who had to suffer from the government. So, you know, it became clear to us that the enemy were dug deeply into the rural population, and that many members of the rural population were working for them in one sense or another, you know, whether it was gathering an intelligence, you know, a situation would happen like a patrol of Marines would be crossing a paddy dike and one of them would step on a mine. And the Marines had been patrolling that area for weeks, and they'd seen Vietnamese walk up and down that same paddy dike and nobody stepped on a mine. So they concluded that the Vietnamese knew where the mines were and they weren't telling us, which of course was true. And all of these things created an awful relationship between the American Marines and the Vietnamese in the area. They were afraid of us with good reason. They were terribly afraid of us, and they hated us. You know, it'd be possible to walk through a village and then look back and see that these people had absolute hatred on their faces. This was the area, it was different everywhere, like Vietnam was a very complex place, but in this particular time in Quang Nam province, that's the way it was.
Were the American soldiers fueling that hatred? Like, were they mistreating them? Did you see that going on?
Yeah, yeah. I've seen villagers beaten. I've seen them take their ID papers and money just to be mean to them. I've seen them burn down villages. There was the Zippo lighter. Everybody had a Zippo lighter, and they'd go through a village and then they'd light the thatch.
And this was just for the sake of it.
Yeah, they're just assuming they were the enemy and they're burning it down. This is meanwhile, people up the chain of command, majors and above, all the way into the rear areas, were trying to make this not be so. They were like, telling people that the war is going very well and Vietnamese love us, and so on and so on. When in fact the people on the sharp end of the fighting were very aware of what was going on. So, yeah. Here's a story. My friend Butch, who I finally ran into years later, was a mortarman at my company in Vietnam. And he was on a patrol, and they had already triggered 2 or 3 booby traps. And the place was so booby trapped that they didn't know when they were going to trigger something or step on a mine. It was just like a horrendous situation, and they were afraid to leave the village and get back on the trail because of booby traps. So this one Marine takes a pregnant woman from the village, puts a rope around her neck, and makes her lead us through the village and out of the village, with the assumption being that she would not, step on a mine, because she would know where it was and she would stop, which is in fact that's what happened. That she stopped right at the edge of the punji pit that had stakes so long it could have skewered somebody from butt to brain. So that was the kind of relationship we had with the Vietnamese in the villages. It was not pretty. I didn't like it, and it changed me forever to see this.
Yeah.
Not all the Marines were sadists. They were not. They were just scared and angry,
Mhm.
and not extensively educated.
Okay. So I see I'll watch in movies sometimes, and I'm curious to know to what extent this is actually real. So there's one really bad Dolph Lundgren movie called Universal Soldier, and the movie opens up with him. Great, now I can't remember his name, um, but he's running around killing innocent civilians and cutting their ears off and making a necklace out of it.
Yeah.
And then Apocalypse Now. I mean, there's a lot of a lot of wonderful scenes where people will just go attack, like the infamous Flight of the Valkyries scene.
Yeah.
Were there people going to that extent, and were they pushed to that limit? Were they losing it in that kind of sense? Were those things actually
There were people removing ears, but not in my unit. I never saw anybody take an ear. I saw some other brutal things, but not taking an ear. I know it happened. It happened.
Mhm.
Apocalypse Now was about the American mind. It was about the hallucinatory reality of that historical moment. And I thought it was quite brilliantly good. I was aware that a lot of what I saw in it was not true, or was true in a different way. Years later, I found out that the colonel in that scene, where with the speakers on the bottom of the helicopter playing Wagner, was an actual person who actually did that.
Okay.
Yeah, this happened, and
Okay. Yeah.
but I'm not sure if anybody ever surfed in the river, or did, that there was a lot of stuff that was far fetched in there. But the scene where the woman comes up and throws a grenade into the medevac helicopter, these kind of things did happen. And the I think that film was really misunderstood. It's about the American mind, the white Western mind. And Coppola had a certain amount of analytical detachment about it. About this is how we thought. This is the West thought it was superior. And thought that the enemy were savages. The last scene in that movie, with all of the bodies hanging there, and this cult created by Colonel Kurtz, was criticized as being racist and hallucinatory and stuff like this. But when I think of the Pol Pot, they had gone into Cambodia, and Pol Pot was a real thing in the 70s. He did massacre millions of people and had piles of skulls and things. That I can't help but think that Coppola was aware of that, and this imbued the scene with this kind of savagery. There are things that Kurtz says in that scene. He tells the story of Vietnamese children who the Americans had vaccinated, and then the enemy cut their arms off because they've been vaccinated. And of course, this is outrageous. This never happened. So there's all kinds of stuff in in the movie, and sometimes you're in Colonel Kurtz's mind, and Kurtz is stark raving mad. Kurtz is making the same point as Conrad's Kurtz did in Heart of Darkness, that there is a level of savagery in human beings that's innate, that, and given in the right, and that society is a set of pretensions that denies that. But if you put them in existential situations, it will come out. So anyhow, that's what I think that film is about. I also think that, films really don't have an obligation to be factual, although it helps when a political situation is as painful as it is.
Agreed.
There were parts of all the films I saw about Vietnam that seemed true, and then a lot that wasn't. There were scenes in Platoon that were true. Stone had done his research, but there was also, just an American guilt trip in that film that became oppressive, and it wasn't real guilt for having had this mindless war. It was a kind of fake guilt that was supposed to somehow get us off the charge, and that heaviness, that particular heaviness in the film, I thought was overdone. And I don't know, The Deer Hunter. I know that Vietnamese and Asians generally have a lot of trouble with that film because of the racist elements. I thought that what was true about that film was that that family of that group of working class guys who had hung out together, there was a level of social class in that film that I thought was pretty authentic. The reality is stranger than fiction. There's the cliche. And human beings are just weird.
Yeah.
And there's a strangeness to all of this that defies any kind of representation.
Yeah. Today, it's interesting, and I don't know if it's PTSD related from people hearing about these stories, but people quite often talk about trying to make some kind of amend uh, or make up in some way for things that happened in the past. Um, are these things at all something you would agree with, or you think there's a different approach?
The amends making.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And some of it's genuine. Like for many years, I was an affiliate of the Joyner Institute for the Study of War and Its Social Consequences that was located at UMass Boston. And the center, which directed by Kevin Bowen, made friends with former enemies. And we began to visit each other. We would bring the Vietnamese over here, and we would go over there to visit them. We also helped them get translated into English. A lot of their work translated into English. Some of the finer poets, Nguyen Sui, Tu Ban Pham Thien Swat, Ngan Ben, novelist Bao Nen, a lot of Le Min Quay, people like this that we helped get translated into English. And the Joyner Center did other things like help build a wing of a hospital. And this was a group of veterans who believed that the war should have never happened, and it was an obscenity. It was a moral obscenity, and wanted to do something, wanted to reconnect with the country. I don't think wanting to be forgiven, I don't think that was part of the agenda. It was part of can we do anything at all to repair one little bit of the damage? And there's a lot of sincerity about that. And then the Joyner Center continued to grow and began to accommodate people from other wars, Rwandans, Israelis and Palestinians, people who had been in the troubles in Northern Ireland. All of these people came to the center and made it a really interesting place. So, yeah, there's that. There's a larger number of former military than one thinks that feel this way. I remember that after the war, there was a blockade that was not lifted until 1994 by Bill Clinton, where Vietnamese couldn't get stuff. You know, it was almost like vengeance. Why anybody would blockade that country after the horror show that had happened there? They couldn't get medical supplies. They couldn't get stuff like incubators for babies and stuff like this. So there were veterans who started going over there on their own to bring these things. You know, there was one guy in a wheelchair who packed his pockets with antibiotics every time he went over. And there was a lot of commitment here. Bruce Weigel, you know, the poet Bruce Weigel, who I probably taught in that course you took, went over there way before it was okay to be there. And when he got there, he was sick with a kidney stone and he was in terrible pain. The authorities did not want him there. You know, they wanted to send him home, but he refused to leave his hotel room. So he passes a kidney stone in the hotel room and then stays there for a while to talk to them. This is the kind of commitment there was to make amends, as you say. Bruce accidentally killed a kid. This is a story he tells now with openly, that they were in an unstable situation and they didn't know who the enemy was, and there was a lot of confusion and movement. And Bruce drew up on a kid that he saw somebody's moving, wearing black, is moving very fast, and Bruce shot him, and it turned out to be a kid. And he carried this the rest of his life. He finally went to Vietnam and adopted a Vietnamese child from an orphanage, brought her home and raised her as his own daughter.
Yeah, I remember you were telling. I remember you told the story
Yeah.
before in class.
So anyhow, that's, this is just typical of a lot of the things that veterans did after the war.
Wow.
Reality is so much stranger than people know that it seems like a UFO showing up would be somewhat anticlimactic.
Yeah.
It's just that who human beings are, um, and what happens to them as they experience life is pretty extraordinary.
So, do you know if talking or veterans going back and doing um, bringing antibiotics, adopting kids, was that therapeutic of its own? Just doing those actions.
I am sure it was, but uh, it isn't why they did it.
Hmm.
It's Larry Heineman, who was one of our group, used to say, he says, "This is not about healing. I don't want to talk about healing.
Yeah.
This is about being there. It's about being awake." Uh, that the word like healing, or veterans going back to Vietnam in order to heal themselves, something exploitive about that. Gee, let's go back, and we killed 4 million of them. Now let's go back and heal ourselves. So that a lot of us had resented the idea that was what was motivating us. That said, of course, it is healing to go back and connect with people and to experience what you're feeling, which is, I think, a definition of healing is to be there for whatever comes up. And also to see Vietnamese happy and successful, and having a life now that the war is gone. You wouldn't believe it right now. When I was there, the Da Nang was an airstrip surrounded by shanty towns. Now there's skyscrapers in Da Nang. There's huge, huge stuff for tourists. Um, so the Vietnamese are, they're doing very well. That all of the logistics and innovation they used during the war suddenly became useful during peacetime. They're just a remarkable people. um, yeah, so the healing word is problematic.
Yeah. When you went, so when you got out of Vietnam,
Yeah,
um, and you were back home,
yeah.
um, was it just something you suddenly wanted to just bury and be done with? You don't want to think about it again. You don't want to talk about it.
Well, it was complicated. I didn't want to have the feelings I was having, but I
Mhm.
did join the anti-war movement almost immediately upon returning to college. So, here I am out getting tear gassed in the streets and helping people who'd been tear gassed, and
Mhm.
playing medic again. Uh, and I that was something I could do. That was a direct action that I could take part in a movement against a war that I didn't believe in, and had seen horrible things in it. But in terms of becoming aware myself of what I was feeling, I fought against that with substances, and with just kind of getting lost in the 60s.
Okay.
I had terrible dreams. I'd get up to go to the bathroom, and then I'd look down and I was walking in blood, like a foot deep, stuff like that. But um, I did, it was complicated, as I said. I did what I thought was right, but I wasn't dealing with myself, which was in big trouble. and remained so for some time.
Yeah. Um, so what was that tipping point for you when you realized that something was wrong and that you may have needed help?
Well, I remember in 1969 or 70, I can't remember which, I had a serious anxiety attack that sent me to the Student Health Center. And the psychiatrist saw me, and he was really detached. I didn't see anything but detachment in him. We talked a little bit, and then he gave me a prescription for something called Stelazine, which I think was the going antipsychotic in those days.
Hmm.
He didn't seem to give a shit if you wanted to, if you wanted to. This was something like, who is this kid? Is he a college kid who's having an anxiety attack? He had no idea who I was or where I'd been. And of course, I wasn't able to really talk about anything real either because I was doing my best to avoid it. I just couldn't stand the anxiety anymore, and that's why I went to this
Hmm.
clinic. And then I got put in a group therapy uh, group for a while, and I didn't know how to be there and tell the truth either. I kept getting involved with the women in the group. So, I was not able to do that kind of work at that time. But I do remember reaching out because I was feeling so bad. And, and I had hallucinations that I wouldn't tell anybody about. I saw dead people. I had horrible dreams. I go 2 or 3 days without sleeping.
Did all this kick in immediately, or was it subtle?
Well, it was often, I mean, some of it had started in Vietnam. When I got short, they sent me to the hospital company for my final weeks. And I began to drink very heavily there, I just didn't like what I was feeling. So it started pretty quick and lasted for a long time. And of course, the 60s were a time to lose yourself. And, if there was a drug, let me have it, and I didn't do any hard drugs, which was a good thing. I never had that kind of addiction uh, beyond alcohol, which of course is an addiction. Um, yeah, so I went through relationships. I stumbled through relationships. I didn't know how to be a partner in a relationship. I scared the women I was with. Um, I got a lot of love from them that I couldn't really recognize, and because I was just too screwed up. So I had a long period of serial monogamy and substance abuse, and I didn't really start uh, doing the work until I got sober in 1987, and I was overwhelmed with what I'd been avoiding, and I ended up finally going to the VA and being given a disability because of it. But I put it off a lot of years, and I was able to find ways of avoiding it. So anyhow, now I try to help other vets.
You see, do you see a lot of the same stories with veterans? They go in, they couldn't
Yeah,
handle.
yeah, and I also see a lot of people who don't have the tools to understand what's happening to them. The VA has gotten much better. Uh, I don't think they knew what was happening with Vietnam vets. Um, it wasn't quite the same thing as people with shell shock from World War II. And none of the medical staff had treated that. in any case. But with Vietnam, it was complicated by how veterans were treated when they came back. You know, in World War II, you came back to victory parades and you were reassimilated into the culture lovingly. And the Vietnam veterans didn't have any place to go when they came back. Nobody wanted to talk to them.
Were people mistreated too? Like, I know that Rambo is not a realistic movie, but uh, in case of anybody watching who doesn't know it, you know, at the beginning, Rambo, Sylvester Stallone's character Rambo is harassed by the police.
Yeah.
Wants to go find somewhere to eat, and he ends up getting arrested.
Yeah.
And charged with resisting arrest. Were veterans mistreated to that extent?
They were mistreated mainly with indifference. They trying to find the right words for this. There were instances where they were heckled, you know, and treated badly. There was also, you know, the anti-war movement in the university was mainly a middle-class movement. So there were a lot of classist projections put on them. The idea that they would dismiss this entire generation of mostly working class men as being baby killers, you know, and people who committed atrocities. That's how we were seen by some people, you know. We were also seen as crazy. In fact, there were, I saw at least two television shows that had crazy Vietnam vets. You know, it's, you know, I mean, the writers didn't work very hard to try to create a crazy person. They say, oh, okay, I'll pick a Vietnam vet. Everybody knows they're crazy. So there was a lot of that kind of cultural projection going on.
Did that make things worse for you, or did you stories?
You know, yeah, that made me, of course, not forthcoming. I didn't talk a lot, you know. I personally didn't get treated badly because I knew people in the movement, and I sort of, you know, I'd done the right thing right away. I just joined the movement. But you know, vets had experiences of just not being wanted, and some of them moved into the woods. You know, my friend Preston Hood, who was a Navy SEAL, moved into the woods in Maine and built himself a house. You know, that he was just did not want to interrelate with the culture that had rejected Vietnam veterans. A lot of them did this, you know, that they just moved away into the boonies. They had trouble getting jobs. There was prejudice against them, that they were seen to be unstable. You know, so nobody wanted to hire them. The right wingers who were so intent on having the war turned their backs on them. So, you know, it was mainly being treated as non-people, you know, and being rejected by their peers. That was extremely destructive. There is a thing that there is a term that came along later that was invented by Jonathan Shea, who is a psychiatrist that wrote Achilles in Vietnam. And he did a lot of work with vets, and he discovered that there was a thing called moral injury. And he describes this as a betrayal by a person in authority in a high stakes situation. So this would look like being put in an impossible situation in Vietnam through failed tactics by which people killed Vietnamese, or you know, just bumbling nonsense, bad logistics, bad command. And it looked like people who did things that went against their moral core. Like my friend Butch, who saw this incident with the rope around the woman's neck, struggled for the rest of his life in this one instance. That you're given orders to go do things and then you end up doing things that go against who you are, your personal beliefs. The My Lai massacre was a case in point. A company commander, Captain Medina, tells Lieutenant Calley, the platoon commander, to kill everything in the village. Now, who knows what he meant by this? At the time, in this particular area, there was such a hatred of civilians and such a distrust of them that he probably meant if you get any fire from that village, just kill them all. And Calley, not being the brightest guy in the Marine Corps or in the Army, to say, oh, okay, now we're going to go in and just kill all those people, which they began to do. There were members of Kelly's platoon who refused to do it. They refused to kill the civilians. And among the ones that did were people who became so emotionally injured from what they'd done that it ruined their lives. There was just no chance for them afterwards. I reviewed a book for the New York Times called 4 Hours at My Lai by Kevin Bilton and Michael Sims about the My Lai massacre, and it is as detailed a documentation as you will find. And one of the things they do is that they follow the lives of the people who participated, both the ones who participated and the ones that didn't, to see what happened to them. And the ones that participated had bad things happen. I mean, they just had the alcoholism. They just ruined their lives, basically, when they tried to accommodate what they'd done. And they believed they were following orders. So you see this as a severe case of moral injury. There was a helicopter pilot, Hugh Thompson, who was flying an observation helicopter over the massacre, who radioed down to Calley and said, if you don't stop killing people, I'm going to turn my guns on you. He was absolutely enraged at what he was watching, this murder of civilians. They tried to shut him up. The command staff offered him a Silver Star and he threw it back in their face. That he was so infuriated by this. And of course, the Army tried to hush up what happened. And Ron Ridenour and Seymour Hersh, of course, brought the story to the public, and they were unable to deny it anymore. But you can see the moral injury here, that people who are given orders to kill civilians and who know deep down that this is not right have to live with this the rest of their lives, whereas the people who gave the orders got off scot-free.
Are you finding this now, now that our war in the Middle East has ended after 20 years of it?
Yeah.
Are you seeing this reoccurring with today's veterans?
You mean moral injury?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And the work that was done by Vietnam veterans with their therapists over the years created a body of knowledge about trauma that everybody benefits from, including victims. And the fact that someone like Jonathan Shea, who is an extraordinary person, could come up with language to describe what was happening to them is quite remarkable. So there are now means of treating trauma that Vietnam veterans didn't have when they came back. People will be able to recognize PTSD. People will be able to recognize moral entry. There is a support system in place for returning veterans that there wasn't when the Vietnam veterans came back. I see this, I see knowledge on the part of doctors and therapists. There is a lag in the system of getting people their benefits, which is an administrative problem. But in terms of the medical staff who are there for veterans, they're very good. And they also know a lot more than the medical staff at the end of the Vietnam War. So I think they're generally speaking in better shape for getting help. I think there's also more cognizance in the service about alcoholism. Alcoholism was a major problem when I was in the service. Now they'll kick you out. If you have, if you're an alcoholic and you don't get help, which they provide for you, they'll kick you out. That they're not screwing around anymore. They'll kick you out for drug addiction. So, the services are much more responsible in terms of allowing these things to become epidemic.
Yeah. Do you have any messages or anything you'd like to share for the people that are going through struggle with this?
Yeah. I recommend, finding a therapist and becoming able to articulate what you're feeling. This is extremely important. Some people don't know how to do that. And I recommend that they not take it out on their lovers and family. And I recommend that they stay away from substances. And I recommend that they learn how to surrender. And what I mean by that is to let go of it and ask for help. But don't try to hide it. Surrender to it that you have an issue, and then ask for help. And there are plenty of people now to ask for help that weren't around when we came back.
Is it a terrifying process to ask for help when you first are?
Sure. It's nobody wants to do it. No male wants to do it in particular. We don't want to say that we're weak. We don't want to say that we're hurting. We were raised in the fuck your feelings culture, particularly if you're raised working class. And men showing their feelings it's slightly less better. It's slightly better than it used to be. It's just people are more willing to do it now because there's an actual language for it. That the result of all of those years of Vietnam vets looking for help and finally finding it and working with mental health facilities to create a language, a literature for it has helped with people, and especially with the idea that it's not shameful. It's not shameful to ask for help. Yeah, I think it is in some sense better.
Yeah. And what do you suggest for people who might know someone that needs help?
Listen, don't judge. Accept them just exactly the way they are. And maybe introduce them to people who know what to do. Send them someplace where they're likely to be around people, who know what's going on. A lot of that's returning now. I've had some kind of counseling. They've had exit consultation. This is going to happen when you go home and so on. So they're encouraged to speak out. This was never the case with us. You know, we were encouraged to shut up.
All right. Thank you, Doug.